Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all. The last time we did a speech on this subject in this building, it happened to be on the day of the Syria conference, with the result that everybody who tried to get in was stopped by the police a half a mile away. So this morning the government haven't organised anything quite so effective. So nice to see you all. Now, it's now exactly 4 weeks until the British people make the most momentous decision of modern times, the most momentous decision probably of our lifetime. And I have to say I rather wish the standard of argument from the other side had lived up to the occasion. In the past few weeks, the British people have been accused not only by the EU, but by their own leaders of being small-minded, ignorant, economically illiterate, and even horrible racists for wanting to leave the EU. We, have been bombarded with a plethora of scare tactics, with myth after myth about the many miracles the European Union brings about, and the disasters that will allegedly rain down on us if we leave. Now, many of those supposed disasters have in fact been extraordinarily unsubtle threats in which European countries threaten to act against their own interest to take revenge on us for the terrible sin of resigning from the club. Now, to parody Groucho Marx, I wouldn't want to be a member of any club who threatened to ruin me if I left it, particularly when those threats have been so petulant and implausible. I do not know what the collective noun for the international elite is, but we've had a whole gravy train of them in the last few weeks, all making assertions that do not add up. We've had the President of the United States, the President of the EU, the head of the IMF, the ex-head of the World Trade Organization, the Governor of the Bank of England, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer, and of course, the Prime Minister. If the tyranny of conventional wisdom has a Praetorian Guard, this is it. Except it's the tyranny of conventional unwisdom. It seemed to me that many of them have been relying on their status and the pace of events to protect them from forensic challenge. The entire Remain case may be, if I may mimic Boris, one big argumentum ad verecundiam, which for those of you who are not Latin scholars means argument depending on authority. They're hoping that the British people will do what they're told unquestionably. They'll doff their caps and defer to their betters. But the British people are made of sterner stuff. And they want to be given the full facts, not just the edited pro-EU version. So they can see the myths and decide for themselves whether ever closer European Union integration is a good thing for them. Now, more than anything, this campaign is emerging as a battle between the establishment and the people. The international, the European, the London establishment standing up for its view of the world versus the British people standing up for their rights, their country, their democracy, and their freedom. Today, I want to unpick some of those arguments and expose them to factual analysis. Pretty much everything I'm going to tell you can be found in the books, as it were, or even seen with the evidence of your own eyes. The British, and indeed the international establishment, do not have a great track record when it comes to the great questions of their age. Brexit, for example, was famously described as a leap in the dark early on in this campaign. That phrase was first used in politics by Lord Derby about the 1867 Great Reform Act. For the establishment, it was a leap in the dark. For the ordinary working Briton, the relaxation of the property qualification gave them their first chance at voting in our burgeoning democracy, their first crack at controlling their own destiny. That so-called leap in the dark was a breakthrough into the sunlit uplands of modern democracy, just as Brexit will be. It's not the last time the establishment has made massively flawed judgments. The gold standard, appeasement, the craven management of decline of our country in the 60s and 70s, the ERM, on the continent the euro, globally the 2008 financial crisis. And we haven't heard from Chilcot yet. Time after time, the elite have got it wrong, and the ordinary people, whose wisdom was derided, have paid. The establishment groupthink on the central issues of the day has too often got it wrong, not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. So this time, we should test their arguments more carefully. Now, both the Treasury and the IMF, in the form of Christine Lagarde, claim that Brexit will cost Britain economic growth. Now, because a gullible British commentariat swallowed that whole, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have doubled down on that claim and say it will now cause a recession. However, remember, neither the IMF nor the Treasury have a very good track record on forecasting. Last autumn, in the autumn statement, the Treasury found 27 billion down the back of the sofa, as it was termed then, only to be strapped for cash by the spring. It cannot accurately forecast 6 months. Why should we believe it when it tries to forecast 15 years? The IMF, by its own admission, famously got the Asian crisis wrong, got the Greek crisis wrong, and attacked Britain's economic performance just before the UK recovery. And of course, from 2005 and 2007, both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister in opposition were telling us that Britain could spend at Labour levels of excess, just before they told us the exact opposite. So their forecasts, their models, their black boxes are not very reliable. But even if their black boxes are accurate and reliable forecasting machines, they're dependent on the assumptions you put in. Economic models are a perfect example of garbage in, garbage out. There's a phrase for people who blindly believe what economic models tell them, and Pache, the Chancellor, the phrase is not economically literate. The assumptions that the Treasury and the IMF have plugged into their models are essentially that we will lose trade in Europe and not gain any in global markets. We'll lose trade in Europe and not gain any in global markets. Neither, in my view, are remotely plausible. All their calculations doing is putting an implausibly precise number on an entirely improbable scenario. Just look at the Chancellor's latest claim that Brexit will plunge us into recession late this year. By predicting the absolutely bare minimum for a technical recession, the forecast is a victory of precision over accuracy and for politics over economics. A forecast designed to deliver the maximum scary headline with minimum justification. As with the last Treasury forecast, dubious assumptions have led to the required outcome. The Chancellor has given a result which allows him to link potential recession, the main cause of which, as he admitted a few months ago, is actually the dangerous cocktail of global risks that all the nations face, and try to put it on Brexit. So the Treasury forecast is not an economic forecast in a normal sense, it's a political forecast with a political purpose. If the Remain campaign's claim is that we're going to be damaged by losing all the benefits of EU membership, let's start by assessing how sizable those benefits are. We should not be ungracious. The European community has been useful to us. When we joined it, it was undoubtedly to our advantage. We were a tottering, old industrial economy, and the European community was a modern, go-ahead trade bloc. To coin an old phrase, they were the future once. Before we joined, our share of the European market was pathetic, at about 4%. After we joined, after about a decade and a half, it doubled to 8%. That was the common market period. That was incidentally what people voted for in 1975. But since then, in what you might term the single market period, it's halved again to less than the 4% we started with. After 40 years, by this measure, we are no better off than when we started. The reasons are clear enough. During the 90s, tariff barriers around the world came down after something called the Uruguay round, including those around the EU. So we lost the protection of those tariffs against global competition. The burdens of single market regulations handicapped us as well, and general competition from developing countries eroded market share. Now, again, all these things you can check. They're straightforward facts, but you use your eyes for this. Your mobile phone, your television, your computer, your camera, your DVD player, all of them come from outside the European Union. Indeed, they come from outside the European Union and any area, and any free trade area within the European Union. They are free trade working by itself. So the consequence of this is also clear. The benefit of being within the EU single market, whilst not zero, is much, much less than it was under the common market period. It's a bad deal, a huge trade deficit with the EU, and a net 10 billion subscription every year on top. That's why we're losing our advantage over countries from outside the EU and markets within the EU. That's why our share of exports that's going to the EU has dropped from over 60% to about 42%. And this share is predicted to fall even further. And this, of course, has implications for employment in the UK. This is particularly notable today because today the immigration figures have come out and they're the second highest on record. And I'll come back to that later. But let's have a quick look at the years since 2010. In that period, 2.5 million jobs have been created in the United Kingdom. In that same time, exports to Europe have been essentially static. Actually, since 2011, they've gone down. Whilst exports to the rest of the world have grown by 57 billion, or 25%. And almost all the jobs that have been created are in sectors that have grown in line with the UK's domestic market and with our trade in non-EU countries. So trade with the EU has almost certainly generated no job growth, zero job growth at that time. The entire growth in jobs came from either trade with the rest of the world or internally driven domestic growth within the UK economy. Add to that the fact that a significant proportion, 1 million out of the 2.5 million jobs created in the UK economy, were taken by EU migrants. And there's significant evidence from the Bank of England, amongst others, that migration pressure has depressed the lowest wages. It's clear that the impact of EU membership in the last 5 years has been deleterious to the poorest workers. Their job prospects and their wages have both been reduced. Now, this is much of the answer to the conundrum of the last few years, economic growth but with low productivity and low wage increases. It's also a stark reminder that it's not absolute growth that matters, it's growth per capita. The government's reliance on GDP as a measure of prosperity has been misleading, especially when considering the high immigration numbers that Britain's experienced in recent years. Since 2010, GDP per capita, the size of the economy per person, a far better measure of people's living standards than raw GDP, has grown at only just half as quickly as ordinary GDP, about 1% a year. Now, before the Great Migration Crisis, a GDP growth of 1% a year would have been considered appallingly poor. Today, it's the norm, and it matters. It's increases in GDP per capita that support growth in jobs, in people's wages, and allows the country to invest in the future and helps us to pay for public services. That's what matters for the people of Britain. To summarise, the Treasury and other establishment claims that Britain's prosperity, trade and jobs pivot on our membership of the EU is pure propaganda. The facts suggest something completely different. In the last 5 years, membership of the EU has not increased net employment at all in Britain, but we have been creating jobs for EU citizens, around 1 million of them. Britain, not the EU, is a job creation machine. The EU, in fact, is a job transfer machine, switching employment from British workers to those from the continent. Now, of course, large-scale immigration is one of the reasons that that other establishment group, the CBI, are in favour of EU membership. A virtually limitless, low-cost, ready-trained workforce is understandably attractive to big business. It's also why, in a moment of frankness, Stuart Rose admitted that leaving the EU would lead to an increase in average wages. This would be particularly true of the least well-paid. The other reason for the CBI stance is the fear that its members would lose their existing market position. Nearly all big companies, and it's understandable, nearly all big companies have marketing, distribution or supply networks in the EU. They have entrenched regulatory positions which protect their particular products. And it's also important to remember that big companies are not particularly good at innovation or job creation. Accordingly, they do not see enormous upsides, but are acutely conscious of the risks. Now, Pascal Lamy, an ex-EU commissioner and ex-World Trade Organization head, is as much an international gravy drainer as Christine Lagarde. He threatened Britain with the loss of European markets, and he didn't mince his words about it. He made it plain that it was a threat of punishment for leaving. Not a rational act of policy, but a threat of punishment for leaving. Now, ironically, being French, he phrased the threat in terms that made it clear that continental politicians fear that the UK will make too much of a success of being outside the EU. That's why they feel it will break up the EU. It will be much too attractive if we are very, very successful. Well, that premise goes rather against every single Remain argument you hear, that they're going to do this to stop us being too successful. Now, let's talk about what will actually happen. People behave in ways that fit the circumstances they're trying to deal with. If it's not too much pain, think back to the 2010 election. David Cameron and Nick Clegg did their best to knock 7 bells out of each other in the election campaign. Then, within 1 week of that campaign being over, we all saw photographs of them gazing adoringly at each other in the Rose Garden. Circumstances have changed, and with it their behaviour. It's understandable, nothing wrong with it. And similarly, after Brexit, the pressures on countries that make up the EU will be different. Free trade with Britain will be in all their interests. And this is particularly true of the most powerful leader in Europe, Angela Merkel. Her economy is dependent on exports, particularly of manufacturers and especially of cars. It actually needs those exports. If those exports slow down, it has terrible shock effects on the German economy. Now, Britain is the second largest and the fastest growing car market in Europe. It will, in not too many years, be the largest car market in Europe. And again, go outside, use the evidence of your own eyes. Audi, BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen alone are over 25% of the British market, with the UK buying 1 million cars from Germany every year. They cannot afford the threat being levelled at Britain, the so-called World Trade Organization terms, because they would involve a 10% levy on car imports. Now, a German chancellor would have to avoid this, particularly in election year. 2017 is general election year in Germany. And in Europe, what a German chancellor wants, a German chancellor eventually gets. Indeed, the first calling point of the UK's negotiator in the time immediately after Brexit will not be Brussels, it'll be Berlin, to strike the deal. Absolute access for German cars and industrial goods in exchange for a sensible deal on everything else. Similar deals will be reached with other EU nations. France will want to protect the 3 billion of food and wine it exports to the UK. We have seen the sort of political pressure that French farmers are willing to bear when their livelihoods are threatened. And France will also be holding a general election in 2017. Italy will deal to protect its billion-pound fashion exports, Poland its multi-billion-pound manufacturing and electronics exports, and so on. So there's almost certainly going to be a deal, and one that means a free market between the EU and the UK. However, let's assume for a second I'm wrong. Let's assume everybody behaves irrationally. And let's be clear, I don't for a moment believe this will happen, but let's just humour the Treasury fantasy, shall we? In that eventuality, people seem to forget the British government will be in receipt of over $2 billion a year of levies on cars alone. Cars alone. There's nothing to stop us supporting our indigenous car industry to make it more competitive if we so choose. WTO rules would not allow us to explicitly offset the levies charged, but we could do a great deal to support the industry we wanted to. Research support, investment tax breaks, lower vehicle taxes. There are a whole range of possibilities to protect the industry and, if need be, the consumer. Now, such a package would naturally be designed, if we designed it, be designed to favour British consumers and British industry. which is exactly why the European Union will not force this outcome. That's the checkmate second move, if that's the way they go, and it's why it won't happen. Now, the other bogus element of the Treasury forecast is a presumption will do badly in global trade negotiations. Now, trade negotiations are exercises in mutual self-interest. They're not power plays, they're not coercions, particularly now the World Trade Organization's rules are in place. And without the emotional politics of the European Union in play, there is no reason whatsoever to expect that most countries in the world would not actively want a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. Now, this makes a claim by the Remain campaign that we'd have to renegotiate 50 trade deals after Brexit look particularly silly, indeed almost hysterical. The simple truth is that under state succession rules, which exist already, under state succession rules, all existing trade deals with non-EU countries would stay in place until either side wanted to renegotiate them. Now, why on earth would any non-EU country behave differently? They've already got a trade deal with us, it works, we carry on with it. Now, of our top 10 non-European trading partners, only Switzerland and South Korea have free trade agreements with the EU at the moment. Is Remain really asserting that South Korea or Switzerland would repudiate an existing trade arrangement with us? Would South Africa or Singapore? Whatever the EU might say, they won't. Which brings us to the next great international grandee that the Remain team trotted out, namely Barack Obama. Now, he was wheeled on stage by the government to try to undermine the argument we'd be able to negotiate our own trade deals, new trade deals, outside the EU. Now, it's not necessary, frankly, to imagine any anti-British sentiment to explain Obama's comments about going to the back of the queue. Indeed, he's clearly doing the British Prime Minister a favour, as was demonstrated by the choice of language. It looked like it came from Downing Street. More importantly, he was simply serving what he saw as America's best interest, trying to keep the United Kingdom within the European Union. Now, Americans have a very poor comprehension of the European Union, and they see having Britain within it as a useful benefit for them, not for us, for them. They have no concept of the cost in lost sovereignty this entails. If they did, they'd be a little more shamefaced in suggesting something that they would never themselves countenance. But none of this makes Obama's comments true. Firstly, he won't be there at the appropriate time, so he won't make the decision. Indeed, no president will make the decision. It will be primarily a congressional decision. Secondly, and more importantly, there is no queue. These matters are handled in parallel. The USA signed 8 FTAs, 8 free trade area agreements, in 3 years recently. Australia, Singapore, Chile, Bahrain, Morocco, Peru, the Dominican Republic, and South Korea. They have a well-established and often used fast-track process. It's highly likely we would manage to negotiate an FTA with the United States in about 3 years. That'd be about the time it would take, well before TTIP is completed, which will stall time after time. And it will be a deal which will be far more tailored to our interests than TTIP will ever be. Outside of the EU, therefore, there are 2 major potential benefits for the UK. One, the ability to pursue lighter and better tailored regulation, not possible under EU membership. And 2, the ability to strike new trade deals with the rest of the world, not possible in a club of 28 members. Now, those actually aren't my words. That's according to Open Europe, who are not supporters of Brexit and whose ex-director, Mats Persson, is now the Prime Minister's European Union advisor. But I agree with Open Europe. Britain would negotiate a lot more trade deals, a hell of a lot quicker, if we weren't leashed to 27 other countries in every negotiation. Negotiations to reach a trade deal between the EU and Singapore, for example, lasted nearly 6 years. It took 9 years to come up with a free trade deal with Canada, which may well founder anyway. The negotiations with the EU bloc and India went on so long that they both gave up. And the EU, can you believe it, does not have trade agreements with China or India, or Russia, or the US. The reality is the European Union's track record on making trade deals is dreadful. It's not poor, it's dreadful. And yet the Prime Minister claims that we sign better trade deals and more quickly with the EU. This is simply not supported by the facts. The claimed benefits from the EU bloc are completely outweighed by the complexity and dilution of dealing with 28 members. And again, I said, with every argument here, we're going to give you some solid facts. So let's compare it with what happens with a single country trying to negotiate rather than the EU. For example, look at Chile, which is, what, a third of our population, so it's not very big. Chile has managed to get trade deals with the biggest economies around the world, including the United States, China, India, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada. The European Union has trade deals with economies which have a total GDP of just 4.7 trillion, 4,700 billion pounds. Chile has trade deals with 40 trillions worth of countries. That's 8 times what the EU has managed to do. Now, not only has Chile got these deals, it's negotiated most of them a hell of a lot faster than the European Union. It took Chile, without all the supposed influence of being a member of the EU, 10 months, just 10 months, to complete its negotiations with China. It took 9 months to negotiate a deal with Australia, 10 with Canada, 12 months with Japan, 24 months with the United States. Now, can the Remain campaign seriously continue to argue we would not be able to open up new trade opportunities if we voted to leave? And before Remain do their normal banal trick when faced with hard facts and try to claim that we're now going for the Chilean model, it isn't just Chile. Singapore, Switzerland, South Korea negotiate their own trade deals without the so-called clout of a big group, and each have FTAs, free trade areas, of over 27 trillion worth of countries. That's, in each case, 5 times the European Union deals. And again, they also negotiate their deals far faster than the EU does. And 90% of their trade deals involve services, critical to the British economy, as opposed to only 2 out of 3 European Union deals. Only 6 EU members have a significant trade surplus in services, and the UK's surplus is twice that of any other nation. And the UK exports more in services to the rest of the world than any other EU nation. So for the EU, trade in services is simply not as much a priority as it is for us. That's why the EU single market in services has stalled for the last X years. So a lot of the EU free trade deals don't cover the areas we are concerned about. And the result is 2/3 of them, our growth exports goes down after we join them, not up. We should also be aware that trade deals themselves can be overestimated in their importance. After all, it's not politicians that trade, it's businessmen. We do as much trade with countries without any sort of deal as we do with the whole European Union. And those countries tend to be the fastest growing. But there's no doubt, as it stands today, we are missing out on huge trade opportunities around the world. The EU's dysfunctional trade policies make it harder for UK businesses to trade with those parts of the world that are growing the fastest. So given how poor the European Union is at negotiating deals on our behalf, is it any surprise that 90% of the EU's trade deals account for just 2% of our exports? Never mind little Englander. Being stuck in fortress Europe, ignoring the exciting economies of the rest of the world, is being a little European. A myopic, introspective, and troubled little European. One of the other supposed advantages claimed for being in the EU is more inward investment. Actually, the highest inward investment in Europe is not in the EU at all. It's in Norway and Switzerland. Even if you take out all the FDI from oil and gas and financial services, they are still higher than any other European Union country. Those countries also have the lowest unemployment, the highest wages, and rather lower levels of inequality, which rather takes off the edge of the claims for economic benefits in the European Union. And before anybody on the Remain side jumps to their usual conclusion, no, I am not arguing for a Swiss or Norwegian option. I'm arguing for something considerably better, because that's what we are capable of. Finally, in economic terms, we have to consider the impact of the Eurozone. Now, I'll not dwell on it because it deserves a whole speech in its own right, but being in Europe, but not the Eurozone, is in many ways gives us the exact opposite of what the Prime Minister claims. The worst of both worlds, with little say in fundamental financial issues, but eventual responsibility for many of the costs when it stumbles. Only last year, we were dragged into the Eurozone's efforts to rescue Greece, when the EU used the European Financial Stability Mechanism to bail out the debt-stricken country against the Prime Minister's protests. Another example of just how vulnerable the UK has become in Brussels. That cost us, if I remember correctly, £840 million against our will. The euro has been devastating for Greece and Southern Europe, but very comfortable for Germany and what might be termed the old Deutschmark zone, which now trades with the rest of the EU and with the world at an effective 30% discount locked in against what it ought to be on its currency. The huge trade imbalances in the Eurozone make it financially unstable, and as we know from recent history, we end up paying for that no matter that we think we've negotiated ourselves outside the rules. Greater separation from this financially unstable structure will not give us perfect protection, but it will be better than being shackled to it. And of course, none of the risk of this, none of that is reflected in the Treasury model. So, to recap, if we leave the EU, we're free to negotiate our own deals faster and they'll be better tailored to our economy than the Union's deals are. Our trade will almost certainly continue with the EU on similar to current circumstances. In a highly improbable event that it will not, we can accommodate with domestic policies using the money released by Brexit and the independence dividend. So both the major premises upon which the Treasury model is based are flawed. And the Treasury did not even attempt to calculate the EEA option. Now, actually, by no means the best option. This is the Norwegian option, if you like, presumably because it looked too good and didn't offer the Chancellor the headlines he was looking for. The Remain campaign has strained every sinew in painting as relentlessly a pessimistic picture of the UK after Brexit as possible, and in doing so, their forecasts have lost all credibility. They have claimed that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs rely on their membership. The reality is that the EU on the continent has been a destroyer of jobs, and here it's created no jobs for Britain in the last 5 years. They have claimed their economic interaction with the continent will all but cease. In the case of one overexcited minister, they'll fall to absolute zero should we leave the EU. The reality is the hard-headed, pragmatic businessmen on the continent will do everything to ensure that Britain continues to trade uninterrupted with the European Union. They'll claim they'll be unable to forge new trade links across the world, that will have no influence, that will be sent to the back of the queue. And I'm sorry, but this is nonsense too. Chile, Switzerland, South Korea, Singapore, all smaller than us, prove that this is untrue. We're members of the G7, the G20. We're on the UN Security Council. We belong to NATO, the OECD, the Commonwealth. We owe none of that to the European Union. We're a global nation with a global tradition. We speak the most important global language, English, the language of science, engineering, medicine, diplomacy, international law, media, the internet. We have a bigger reputation and reach than any country of 60 million has a right to expect. We're the nation of Darwin, of Dickens, of Shakespeare, Shelley, Newton and Nelson. We're a country with a fabulous global tradition and a fabulous global reputation. How can Remain possibly suggest that we cannot flourish should we decide to govern ourselves. Britain's always prospered when we've been at our most daring, our most adventurous, when we've raised our eyes to global horizons. That's what this referendum is all about. Do we want to accept decline, as we did in the 60s and 70s, now part of a declining regional bloc with limited potential? Or do we want to take back control of our country, control of our destiny, and show the world how great Britain can be? Thank you. And nobody nodded off. Any questions? No? Yes, the back, sir.
I think you made a very good job of refuting the arguments from the other side, but I'd like to suggest you should be a bit more aggressive and put the boot into the European economy, because the EU is a drag on global growth. It has disastrous demographics. It's got worse pension liabilities than us.
Sure.
The German and French banks are still dying a death of 1,000 cuts because they've never marked their liabilities to market. So Asia is where all the growth in the world is coming from. So I would suggest you focus much more on those opportunities and point out that Europe is holding us back.
Yeah, well, that's the very short version of the speech. You're quite right. I mean, you've got to be a bit wary of sort of instantaneous data in this. I mean, what's likely to happen in the next few months is a slight upturn in Europe's circumstances. Because after years and years and years of misery, there will be some recovery in the southern states of Europe. There's bound to be. It's, you know, it doesn't go on forever, this sort of stuff. And so one doesn't want to make oneself a hostage to fortune in the immediate data. But you're quite right. In aggregate terms, Europe will grow between 0 and 3%. The rest of the world will grow between 3 and 7%. The bits of the rest of the world that will grow fastest will be the English-speaking parts and the Commonwealth, over and above China, because China's hesitating at the moment. But generally, over a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, the rest of the world is massively more important to us as a nation, as a trading nation. The statistic that I mentioned halfway through all of that was that already those parts of the world for which we don't have a free trade agreement, just those parts of the world which British tradesmen, British businessmen have gone out and captured for us, are already a bigger market than the European Union is now. So, you know, you're dead right. It's a sclerotic continent now. It's an old continent. It's suffering from serious structural internal problems. It's dangerously financially unstable. And yet, that's where we seem to think our future is. So you're dead right. And yes, I was in the business of refutation today rather than building the alternative picture. I think the alternative picture is a fabulously upbeat one. It really is. And I don't even think there's going to be a short term. One or two of the Brexit economists think there'll be a sort of ripple immediately afterwards. It won't be. There'll be a couple of years in which we do the negotiation. The markets will stabilise. Our British businessmen will start to realise where the opportunities are. As we do, we'll be doing 15 negotiations at once with all our best interest areas: China, India, America. And they'll all come to fruition within less than 5 years. So there are big opportunities out there, absolutely huge opportunities out there, and it'll be fantastic. It will be a complete renaissance era for British business. So you're dead right. You're dead right. I'm being pessimistic, not pessimistic. I'm being too gloomy, but that's because I'm focusing on the Remain case today. That's all. Ma'am, yeah, at the back.
There's so much speculation in the media, doom and gloom, and collusion with the Remain campaign, I think, on behalf of the media. Just how easy do you think it will be for Britain to have access to the single market if they leave?
Well, I took you through the sort of negotiating gambits that will happen, but the big nations in Europe all have a massive interest in a deal. I mean, take cars alone. Cars, the one with a big penalty. That's 26 billion all told. I mean, the The Germans are 16 billion, but there's another 10 billion elsewhere in Spain and Italy and France. And they've really got to have that deal. And then most of them have got election years coming up. They will not want to be turning around to their own countries and saying, well, one of our biggest industries is going to take a bit of a hiccup, sorry. And this won't be done in private. I mean, any British negotiator worth his salt will be talking to the newspapers on the continent, as well, and the media on the continent as well as here. Indeed, you'll find a lot of continental populations have sympathy with us. I don't think the risk is anything like what it's being portrayed as. And that's why I made this point about what, you know, that they make two completely contrary arguments. On the one hand, they say that it's going to be a disaster for us. But on the other hand, they say, but we're going to put Europe at risk because everybody else will be tempted to do the same thing. Those two things don't hang together. What they're afraid of is a spectacular success. They understand that. And I think it will be a spectacular success, but it's in their own interest to keep the deal. The bigger success we are, the bigger the market we are, the more useful we are to them. Now, there will be ripples along the way. I mean, the 2 or 3 months after the referendum, there'll be screams galore. Absolutely. But it will stabilise, and they'll realise what their interest is, and that's where we'll play it. Madam.
Thank you very much for giving me a positive view with regard to Brexit. I, like you, have listened to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer issuing absolutely dire warnings if we dare to vote to leave. Economic Armageddon will follow. I feel their comments have demeaned the United Kingdom, and in turn, I think they've demeaned their own office. What do you think?
I'm trying not to make this a personal battle. Let me say this. I think from their own point of view, they've misjudged their tactics. Even if you take aside what their responsibilities are to Britain, and they are important, and you're quite right, I think they misjudged their own tactics for 2 reasons. Firstly, in terms of effectiveness, it hasn't worked. I mean, after all, our own Chancellor and our own Prime Minister have effectively talked the pound down for the last year, and they've effectively talked up the risks of Brexit for the last year. 2 things have happened in that time. Firstly, the pound has appreciated against the dollar. It hasn't gone down, it's gone up. Right? That's the first thing. There's been a bit less talk about the pound risks recently. And the second thing that's happened is last year, after a government was elected, a majority government against the odds was elected with the promise of a referendum, we had the highest inward investment in our country in history. So all those hard-bitten businessmen, the Toyotas and all those people who were planning their 5-year and 10-year plans for factories and so on, took one look at the election result, said it didn't matter to them, and they carried on with it. So it hasn't done the harm, you assume. The other thing I'd say is this, I mean, just from their own point of view, when an equivalent referendum to this one happened in Denmark, when there was a referendum over whether they should join the euro or not, on the pro-joining the euro side, there was claim after claim, a bit that's happened here, and it got progressively more hysterical. The claims got bigger and bigger, more and more Armageddon, as you say, a plague of locusts, a plague of frogs, a death of the firstborn, all that sort of stuff, which of course is the sort of standard mockery here. So much so that it became a weapon of the anti-euro campaigners to mock the sheer over-the-top nature of the pro-euro campaigners. The last joke was, and of course, if we don't sign up, there'll be an 18-foot high wall built between us and Germany. That was the joke on the last day. And the result was they were beaten by devastating proportions. Denmark didn't join the euro. So I think it's self-defeating from their own point of view. I'll say this about the sort of battles between the individuals or people in this. Right at the beginning of this campaign, I said that it actually didn't matter who the leaders were and who fought on both sides, because it's not a general election. It's a campaign over the future of the country, of course, but it's a campaign that ought to be won by ideas, not by personalities. It ought to be won by the belief that this is the best for us, not that I like that Prime Minister or that leader of the opposition or whatever. And I'm trying to stay away from the battle that does the other, does the personality issues rather than the ideas. I think we will win this on ideas. Our opponents' ideas will fall to pieces under inspection. They will then exaggerate them. They'll fall to pieces even more quickly. They'll exaggerate again. It'll fall to pieces even more quickly. And that's why on the 23rd of June, we'll be looking forward to a free country. Next question. Mr. Holloway. And my colleagues, Adam Holloway.
10 years or so ago, I wandered into your office and told you that I wasn't going to vote for you in the Conservative leadership election. One of the reasons that I felt comfortable voting for David Cameron was because he was a Eurosceptic. Why is it, do you think, that he doesn't see this extraordinary opportunity by our view? And why do you think so many Conservative MPs who were also at that time comfortable with him being a Eurosceptic now seem to be supporting him?
I'm not sure I can answer the second one. I mean, the first question, I think, is partly what happens inside the establishment. I mean, before you got here, Adam, I think it's before you got in, I was talking about the fact that this is an establishment versus anti-establishment battle in many ways. In Britain, the establishment often gets things very, very badly wrong, from the gold standard forward, you know. And the reasons for that normally is there is a preference for what you currently have. But you always hang on to nurse for fear of something worse in Britain. And today, the CBI, all their members, have got all these networks built around Europe. They've got regulatory structures that protect them. They've got lots of money invested. And most big businessmen, by the way, are not very brave entrepreneurs. They're basically a bit like bureaucrats, right? So that's where it starts. And Whitehall the same. Whitehall's structure is linked in with the European Union. Many of them, they got career opportunities working in Brussels or within the Commission. So you've got that too. So you've got a vested interest effect too. So what happens is the Prime Minister becomes surrounded by large numbers of people who he takes very seriously for most things. The same people he asks advice on, what should we do about tax policy, what we should do about economic policy, turn around to him and say, but we don't want to take any risks at all. Now, there are risks in this decision, risks on both sides, and anybody who tells you there aren't is just lying to you. Of course there are risks on both sides, but the risks actually for the country as a whole, not for those groups of people I've talked about, for the country as a whole, the risks are much bigger in staying in. Let me give you a single example I didn't mention. Take the euro risk. One of the reasons that today's immigration numbers are the second highest in history is because of the effect of the euro on southern Europe. I mean, not all of the people coming in are from Romania. They're coming from Greece and from Italy. Now listen, if I were a Greek or Romanian, I would be in London. I'd be here working, making the best of our economy, getting a job. Good for them, frankly. But every time there is a big problem on the continent, the problem will spill over to us if we can't control ourselves, control our own destiny, and it'll spill over to us in ways that we can't stop. You know, you can't negotiate that out. You know, you can't negotiate out the fact that if the whole of the continent has a sick period in economic terms, we pick up a bigger portion of the bill. We pay 12% of their budget as is now. So all of those pressures come on the Prime Minister. And, you know, he's human. And he believes them. He takes it on board. These are people he trusts. So there's a good reason for a bad outcome there. Sir.
President Obama came here not to further our best interest, but he talked with Americans on the quiet. What the Americans are dreading is the fact that the European Union may collapse if Britain leaves. Please comment.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it'll collapse. There's a lot of hyperbole about it falling apart. Let me tell you what I think will happen if we leave on the 23rd. The first thing that will happen is some countries will think about leaving. You know, some countries will think about having their own referendum. There's no doubt about that. Some of them on the sort of southern end of Europe because their populations are rightly very unhappy with the European Union's treatment of them. And at the other side, you're going to have countries like the Finns, the Swedes and the Danes and maybe the Dutch, who are unhappy for different reasons. They're the sort of prosperous ones who don't like the loss of democracy, don't like carrying too much of the bill, that sort of thing. I think in the former case, nothing will happen in the southern ones. In the latter case, what our departure will do is increase the power of the Nordic countries and the Dutch in their arguments with the Commission. And that will be an undiluted good thing. For the Commission to realise that it hasn't got absolute power, it can't overrule nation states, that it has to pay attention to what populations care about, will make the European Union more stable, not less. And so actually will do them a favour. There's one other thing which will not make you quite so comfortable, and it's this. If we depart, we are the primary grit in the oyster when it comes to preventing the euro evolving into a single European state. Because the euro really demands central taxation powers, central banking powers, all sorts of central controls, central regulatory structures and so on, which will then allow them to transfer money to Greece to help them out, to control Greek banking and so on. That will make the European state more stable, but it'll accelerate the move towards a European state. In my view, if you want to worry about a risk of our leaving, that's the risk you have to worry about. Are we comfortable with a big single European state evolving rather more quickly on our doorstep? And I think it's the least bad outcome, frankly, from that point of view. It's not likely to fall apart. Ironically, again, in terms of inconsistencies in this, there have been people talking about it being a threat to the global economy. The only threat to the global economy is if people start doing what they're threatening to do, putting up trade barriers, preventing us dealing with them again. That's a threat to the global economy, not us leaving. Yes, sir.
When we leave the European Union, should we rejoin NAFTA?
Well, there are those who think as a transitional phase it might be a good idea, as a stepping stone. My view is that we'll have a much bigger say in our destiny than, let's say, the Norwegians and the Swiss do, because we are just so much bigger and more powerful. But it may be possible that it takes a little longer than 2 years to do our deal, in which case it's a stepping stone. It's not the end of the journey. The other thing that may happen if we leave is that, of course, EFTA becomes much more powerful. All of a sudden, it will become probably the most successful trade area in the world. Because, remember what I was saying about Switzerland having 27 trillion of free trade area already negotiated. And we would slide in behind them. We'd get in their slipstream on that, you know. I'm sure Norway's got some similar number. I just didn't look it up, you know. And we would create a huge free trading area by doing that. And then our leverage gets even bigger. So it may be one way. An interesting point here, which perhaps you should all think about. One of the great anomalies in this is that the people tend to assume that the Leave side of this argument are, as it were, the next government, right? And that they're going to be the ones making the decision. It won't be. It'll be whoever's in government will make the decisions. All we can do is show what's possible. That's all we can do, is show what's possible. But when people say to me, well, you know, what will happen? It's a little like saying to me, I'm halfway through winning a chess game, right? I know I'm going to win because I've got all the positional advantages. I've taken the other side's queen, and you know I'm on top. I can't tell you exactly what the checkmate will look like. Will it be a back rank mate? Will it be a smothered mate? What it will be? I just know I'm going to win because I've got a fabulous position, right? And it's the same here. There are a lot of options, all of which are better than where we are now, but which one of them turn out will depend on the response. You know, whether Romania starts to do what they're doing now with the Canadian deal, you know, and jumping up and down and causing a fuss. So just think about that. When somebody says to you, what will it look like? You say, it looks like a winning game. What exactly the game will finish as, what sort of checkmate, what sort of outcome, or whether the other side just concedes, we don't know quite yet. But there are several good options, and a stepping stone through EFTA is one of them. Lady right at the back.
If we're perhaps only halfway through the chess game, can you see a situation in which the Remain side wins this time, but it may be in the future there could be a government led by the Brexit camp, and there's an opportunity for a second referendum?
I don't.
Question as well, which is who is the best person to lead negotiations with the
I can't give you a name. Let me do the two questions. I don't think there'll be another referendum, whatever happens. I really don't think it. I mean, the Scotnats said, you know, once in a generation, and then they immediately reneged on that after they lost. I think this is once in a generation. This is the sort of thing you decide every 40 or 50 years, no more than that, really. And those who think, you know, if Brexit wins, we'll suddenly have a new negotiation, are whistling in the wind. Now, who would do? I don't know who will do the negotiation. I think, in the event of the Brexit side winning the argument, which I think actually is the fractionally higher probability now, I think David will have to appoint somebody who's got credibility with it. I mean, it's very difficult to say something's impossible and then try and do it yourself. I always used to, when I was in business, and I used to run businesses and do turnarounds, one of my standard lines was, when somebody tells me something's impossible, what he means is he can't do it. Not quite the same thing, but it does undermine your position. So he would, if I were in his position, or if I were giving him advice, I'd say the morning after the Brexit side has won, announce who you want to do the negotiation, and tell the country that person has a free hand, because that person's going to have to make all the decisions on it. And that's the best I can get in terms of telling you what sort of person would end up doing it. Yes, ma'am.
Do you actually believe yourself that Brexit will happen? Because preliminary poll results, they show it won't. Or maybe the Leave campaign is not putting enough effort in giving out facts and figures and persuading people that Britain will prosper. The only voice of reason so far was Steve Hilton, the former advisor to David Cameron, who said that EU is a sinking ship. There is nothing to hang on to. But otherwise, it's more like scaremongering, and on both sides.
Well, I don't like metaphors like sinking ship. I mean, what does that tell you, really? First, let's deal with the polls. The polling numbers are very strange in a couple of respects. Firstly, you've got a big gap between the online polls and the telephone polls. Now, some of that may be demographics. There's quite a lot of suggestion that the telephone polls are double sampling graduates for some reason, for example, just to give you one. So it may not be an appropriate sample. But that can't explain all of it. It's too big a gap for that. And I think that part of this is that for a very, very long time in British history, Brexit has been a very unfashionable cause. Very unfashionable. And that has transformed dramatically in the last decade. I won't tell you who, but a person who represents me in the European Court, in a case I'm bringing in the European Court. So you might imagine a very high-ranking North London lawyer, very liberal, very liberal disposition. You would have thought absolutely the person naturally to be in the Remain camp, said to me the other day, you know, I'm thinking about Brexit, and I'm finding this time and again that the people you would not think to think about Brexit are doing so. It's always dangerous to judge from the people we meet, because we tend to meet people who agree with us, but the more I see, the more people I find are saying, I'm being persuaded, I'm changing to Brexit and so on. So I think the polls are just plumb wrong, actually, but I don't think it'll be a big difference. I don't think it'll be a sort of 60-40 in favour of Brexit. I think the outcome will be within 5 points of 50%, either way. And at the moment, I think the slight odds are in favour of Brexit, but it's only slight odds. So this last 4 weeks' battle is going to matter enormously. No? Yes, sir.
You didn't mention the fishing industry.
No.
I've read that 100,000 jobs have been lost in the fishing industry purely because of the common fisheries policy. We gave away most of the fish, whereas Britain has a natural, well, before joining the EU, it had control of 70% of the European fish. How many jobs do you think could be regained from that?
I can't give you a guess off the top of my head, I mean, about fishing, but you're right. I mean, we did a terrible negotiation when we first entered the EU on fishing, and then a worse one later on when the Spaniards entered. But the simple truth is it would give us control of a large number of fishing grounds. And that's important for jobs. It's also important for another reason. The EU policy on fishing has been very poor. It's been very deleterious to fish stocks and species survival rates and so on. So I think we'll both get jobs back out of it, but we'll also get better fish husbandry than we currently have. I mean, there are plenty of other countries outside the EU, Iceland for one, who are much more successful at this than we have been, or the EU has been, and that's a very great gain. Sir?
What's going to be the position which has been highlighted recently about if we come out, the position of Gibraltar vis-à-vis Spain? I mean, Spain have been beating Gibraltar and probably carry on being beating Gibraltar. Will things fundamentally change, or just the beatingness will be stepped up a bit?
Yeah. Very often I tell people when I was Europe Minister that my nickname was Monsieur Non in France and Herr Niet in Germany. And because there are ladies in the audience, I can't tell you what they called me in Spain, because it was so rude. But that was mostly because of the Gibraltar circumstance. And I'm afraid, inside or outside the EU, it will make no difference to the fact that Gibraltar will always be a sore point for us with Spain, always. They see it as an assault on their national honour, even though they have equivalent islands off the coast of Morocco, Maluta and one other, I think. And that will always go on. And it's entirely possible that for a short time after Brexit, we will have to do some things to protect Gibraltar. But we'll have to do it. I mean, that will be a tiny cost. Remember, we're going to get 10 billion back net, rather more gross, from doing this. We'll have a bit of money in our pocket to protect them, but we will have to do something. I know the people of Gibraltar, I think, are more likely to vote to remain because they fear that. But we just have to, this is an issue of national honour in every much the same way as the Falklands was. No. And if they did, they'd lose. And that's without us sending any troops there. Yes, ma'am.
I think we need more facts and figures, and we need to be a little bit more direct with our approach as far as Leave Europe is concerned. There's a lot of talking, but not enough directness about facts. Little things like why are there nearly 500,000 French people in London? Why are there, I don't know how many million Italians? Why are there many Somalians who started in Europe but came here to thrive and prosper? Britain has something that has something very special to offer, and it must be promoted with facts and figures, especially, I think, to the foreigners who came, like me, to settle here. We have benefited a lot from your openness to newcomers, and they should be addressed and they should be voting for leaving Europe. And I think that it's got to be a lot more facts and figures. It is a fact that Europe is showing a lot of failures, and why join something that is fragile at the moment, to put it mildly, when you have something that's very strong and very special in the whole world, outstanding.
Yeah. Well, I've been trying today to give you a lot more facts. In fact, there's a sort of limit on the number of facts you can give.
No, but publicly, not here.
Yeah. Well, this is public. Don't worry, it'll be out there. Yeah. Yes, I agree. And I mean, part of it, I think, there has been a defensiveness on the part of the Leave camp to some extent. That if we say we're going to do this, that'll get knocked down, and that they always do that. So you saw, for example, when Michael Gove talked about a great free trade area as what we were going to try to create, and he said from Iceland to Albania, I think it was the phrase he used, and that became called the Albanian option. Which is why I quite carefully say this is not the Chilean option, this is not the Swedish option, whatever it is. So people have been a bit nervous about it, but I think you're dead right. I don't think you can beat something with nothing. I think we have to argue off the base of the facts. I mean, take the issue of people being here the reason people are here from France and from Italy and so on is because their jobs are here. Because we've got a successful economy. 2.5 million jobs in 5 years is a hell of a good track record, That's why 1 million came here. Actually, it's not for benefits, by the way. It's actually for jobs in most cases. I also think we need to say what will happen afterwards. My view is very simple, that when Brexit happens, we say to everybody who's here already, that's it, you've got leave to remain, unless they're criminals. Yeah, unless they're criminals. But explain. Actually, the decision's already taken. the thing called the Vienna Protocol specifies what happens, and it incidentally protects Brits abroad. So if if your mum lives in Malaga or somewhere, then she's not going to be deported because we've exercised our right to leave the European Union. So no, you're quite right. There's a need for a lot more facts, and there's a need for sort of an upbeat view of what we're going to do. But always remember my chess analogy. We can tell you what it will look like broadly, but we can't tell you the absolute detail of every return, and neither can the other side, by the way. They can't tell you what will happen in a couple of years to Greece, what will happen to the European banking industry because of the stresses of the euro, what will happen in terms of the voting patterns in Europe, because the Euro group will vote as a bloc and we will be the only one outside it eventually, maybe us and Denmark. All those things are uncertainties too. Every one of these meetings you go to should demand more facts, because it's the way we'll win in the end, because the facts and the events will help us. So.
The last, Conservative government sort of manifesto reducing immigration to tens of thousands. We stay in the EU, that would be a broken promise, and what sort of damage?
Well, of course it'll be a broken promise. It's impossible at the moment. I mean, 333,000 is, I think, today's number, and it's because we don't control it. We do control, to some extent, the non-EU ones, but there's also a secondary problem here. For as long as you're in the EU, the incentive not to do a proper job of border control is quite large. The first thing the Treasury will economise on is the border agency. Why? Because, well, they come from Europe. It doesn't matter. We have an open border. Now, it's not quite true, but that's what tends to be the habit. And Europe actually becomes the excuse. Now, we will not be going, and let's understand this, we will not be going to zero immigration. I think somewhere between 0 and 100,000 is where it'll be. And some years it'll be nearly 100,000, and some years it'll be nearly 0, depending on the economy. If the economy is growing gangbusters, it'll be going up. If we are short of doctors will be going up. We'll have a points type scheme of one sort or another, and that's how it'll work. But we can't possibly do that at the moment. We cannot deliver on that manifesto promise as it now stands. You're the last one, I think, sir. Yeah.
Just going back to that lady's point, there's loads of French people living in London. My wife and I sent our 3 children to lycée, because she's French. And we know loads of parents, and they're desperately applying for British citizenship because they're so worried about what's going to happen. So it's an interesting point. They have no intention of going back to France or whatever.
No. I mean, the interesting things are, one, most foreigners living here, if we have Brexit, will want to stay. Yeah? And it's not their fault that we've messed up our rules. It's our fault. So we shouldn't punish them. That's the first thing to understand. Secondly, most of them understand that. Most of them, I know quite a few foreigners in the UK who don't have a vote, but they said, if I had a vote, I'd vote Brexit. There are plenty of Frenchmen who would vote Brexit, half the Italians. There was a survey a couple of weeks ago which of Italian views on this, and 48% of them said if they had a referendum in Italy, they would vote to leave. Now just think, this organisation is based on something called the Treaty of Rome. It was invented in Italy, effectively, by a man called Martino, along with Schumann and Monet. So there's a widespread understanding of what we're trying to do is not hostile to everybody. Put it that way. It's not hostile to everybody, and it certainly isn't. We want to be civilized in our behaviour towards foreign people living here. We want to be civilized in our behaviour to foreign people who want to live here within the constraints of our national interests, which is fine. And I think people understand that. And when we leave, eventually, we want to be friends. This is our cultural home, Europe. I love Europe, I just don't like the European Union. It's really as simple as that. And you'll find nearly everybody on the Leave side of the campaign exactly the same position. We love Europe. We think it's a wonderful continent. It's a wonderful set of cultures. It's got wonderful diversity and very great people and very great creativity. But we just don't want to be shackled to a bureaucratic organisation that purports to represent Europe. And so, the most important thing in some ways in the days after Brexit, are the tenor of what we say. That we shouldn't be strident, we shouldn't be triumphalist, we shouldn't be demanding straight away. We'll have some demands, but not straight away. We should be generous. We should make it plain that the Europeans are our friends, and Europeans in the UK have got every right to stay if they so wish. And if we start down that route, I think that may well be one of the biggest solutions to the hysteria that the other side have whipped up over this. If we are the most civilized, we'll get the civilized outcome. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming. Well done.